Greetings. This is part 2 of the Law, Social Control, Surveillance, and Privacy videos. I'd like to go ahead and start by talking a little bit about virtual personality. And according to Abajois in 2011, in his book, he states, the virtual personality is more assertive, less restrained, a little bit on the dark side, and decidedly sexier. So this book really I thought was a wealth of information in looking at possible personality effects as well as changes. And it's called Virtually You, The Dangerous Powers of the E-Personality. So we get into the situation of asking the question, can the virtual personality lead to not only aggressive or deviant online fantasies that are shared with others, but also shared in face-to-face interactions with negative consequences. And he talks about how boundaries may become more clouded and the individual may have a different sense of their self. He also discusses 5 psychological forces related to the E-personality, which include grandiosity, narcissism, darkness, regression or immaturity, and impulsivity. And it's a very interesting feature to think about how the virtual personality materializes and how it affects the sense of oneself. Now, in their book, Infinite Reality, Avatars, Eternal Life, New Worlds, and the Dawn of the Virtual Revolution, Blaskovich and Beilenson talk about virtual reality. To cite them, virtual reality will raise identity switching to whole new levels. From questions of social roles to gender to ethnic or tribal affiliations, identity will become radically more plastic. The term I like to use in discussing roles related to virtual reality would be fluid, that identities may become more fluid, so more dynamic, ever-changing, if you will. And in summarizing some of the research, Blaskovich and Beilenson showed that those who engage in virtual reality are more likely to believe their virtual or avatar actions. And in one study conducted by Segovia and Beilenson, they showed that by observing an avatar of oneself in a virtual reality environment, false memories could be implanted in children. Now, if you think about the false memory debates that really took root in the early 1980s and have continued ever since, this adds a whole new dimension when you talk about virtual reality environments and virtually reality environment false memories that certainly would have a very new dimension in the criminal justice system and in the courts, for example. So that's one large change that we could take a look at. Also, we may ask again, what do people search for? And now we know. This is a fascinating book by Doctors Ogas and Gadam. In 2011, they published A Billion Wicked Thoughts, What the World's Largest Experiment Reveals About Human Desire. So in this book, we find out what men and women search for and like to watch online in regards to sexuality. For example, they found that for men, age was the most frequently searched variable in sexual searches, with a large proportion of men searching for underage females. But also, they mentioned that older women were popular among male searchers as well. And it's not only a fascinating book if you want to take a look at desire online and differences on a variety of factors as well as similarities. It also presents a very nice model of how to conduct online research using some of the newer tools that are available. And of course, now we can get more information on not a specific person necessarily searching for something, although that's a whole nother lecture in itself, but what groups search for. For example, we can look at what are the most popular searches in particular geographical locations, for example. And much to State Chamber of Commerce workers, they may not be happy with what some of the researchers find sometimes. But I've seen research before where, based on searches, they begin to make some assumptions about certain features in that state, in that location. For example, in terms of drug abuse or alcoholism or seeking therapy or certain sexual practices or depression. And so it's a fascinating area, and a lot of the Google Analytics stuff that's available online is used for this now. In addressing online sexuality, Ogas and Gadam state, forbidden acts have a very special power to arouse, and they point out that it is the immorality and dangerousness of these sexual situations that arouse both men and women. And so they spend some time not only presenting the data and how they collected all the data, but they also interpret the data and put it into theoretical perspective. So a very, very fascinating book indeed. Also, what I wanted to mention that when we wrote our book and published it back in 2013 on sex crimes committed by clergy and teachers, we had a whole chapter on cyber crime and related to abuse, sexual abuse by clergy and teachers. But one part we did note is when I researched what's on a cell phone. And I call it what's on your neighbor's smartphone, but that probably is not a good way to put it, because certainly I didn't view my neighbor's smartphone. I didn't want to say what's on my smartphone, because that wouldn't be the case. I didn't want to say what's on your smartphone, because I don't know what's on your smartphone. But basically, we can look at people's smartphones, and we might find all kinds of things. I was looking at what might be related to relationship apps at the time back, and this was probably around 2012. So things have probably increased and changed. But what I found were things like Flirt Maps, a dating service to meet people in your geographical vicinity. Grindr, GPS-driven system to find gay, bi, or curious men. My Date, online dating. Date Chat, GPS-driven dating service. OkCupid, online dating service. And then iSyn, adult dating, GPS-driven service for adult matchmaking from soft to extreme. For example, the application presents a question, what are you into, and provides options such as indoor, outdoor, etc. with the whole list. The whole thing, though, basically is that this small device, this smartphone, is being used now for a variety of ways for people to meet and interact for certain things that have really never been done before like that. Certainly years ago, if people wanted to meet, they met maybe through friends, or they might go to a discotheque, or they might put a personal ad in the newspaper. But this has changed everything. So it's changed the ways people interact and relate and meet. I remember, I think I was teaching in a counseling course years ago, back in the 90s, and I met a student who had met his wife through online dating, and that was the first time I had ever met someone who actually met a partner through online dating. And I wondered, is this going to take off? Is this going to be something that occurs in the future? And certainly that was the case. Also, we would want to take a look at simulations, and we're still in the early stages of understanding the implications of virtual reality and the effects on the self and behaviors. But also we note that people can simulate sexual fantasies, aggressive fantasies, all kinds of fantasies through online interaction. And the example provided by Blazkowicz and Beilinson again, and also Levy, focused on Second Life users and how that may materialize, and certainly a very different situation than what we've seen in the previous time periods. So, what's the future look like? Well, another excellent book, Alone Together: Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, by Professor Sherry Turkle. She also has a more recent book out, but I wanted to just cite that book. And she states, our online selves develop distinct personalities. And so we risk treating others in a depersonalized manner. And I saw, we see that all the time. If you just look at newspaper comments, that there'll be a tragic situation, all these people will comment, how terrible it is. But then all these people also make jokes and say terribly thoughtless, mean-spirited stuff, all in this anonymous, scenario. Of course, sometimes things don't get, sometimes things that people think are anonymous end up in the newspaper. For example, if a politician uses Twitter to tweet his, if he uses Twitter to tweet adult photographs, for example, and he thinks maybe it's one person he's interacting with, but it ends up going to, hundreds, then trouble will ensue. So, obviously we've seen cases like that. So the future really looks complex and unpredictable. What's going to happen next? And then we also want to look at how robots will be used, how robots will aid people with paraphilias or unusual sexual practices, and will there be different laws as it relates to the use of robots? How will that materialize? So our legal system's trying to catch up. So that also is a fascinating area. I apologize if you hear the edger outside. That's one thing technology has not been able to make, the soundproof edger or leaf blower, but hopefully they're working on that in the labs. So I want you to think about all this and, bring it back to our book, Windows into the Soul: Surveillance and Society in an Age of High Technology by Gary T. Marks. When I read this book over the summer, and I found it not only fascinating, but downright alarming. And then I also read some other books related to cybercrime and tracking and everything else. And so I was in some ways surprised, some ways worried, some ways relieved. I saw that there were always going to be multiple ways of looking at all these technologies, and certainly social control plays a huge role. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.